name is Kelly, and I gave my birthday away. My pastor at church asked me if I was willing to give up my birthday to raise money for a well on the other side of the world. We have a missionary who is working with people in Pakistan. They have to give their children dirty water that is full of germs. Many of them get sick from it. Some people even die from the contaminated water. We found out through our church that this missionary could build a well for these people for $1,500. I invited my friends to come and celebrate my birthday. The invitation said, please bring money instead of gifts so we can help people without water. I didn't really miss getting gifts because I already have everything I need. It made me feel good to use my birthday to help someone else. My friends were really generous. I was really surprised by how much money we raised. We were actually able to pay for the entire well project. The well was built about a month after my birthday party. It was surprising how fast that happened. They sent me pictures and a message saying thank you. When I see the pictures of those kids getting clean water, it makes me feel good. After my party, I started getting invitations from my friends who were doing the same thing. It was really cool to see my friends follow that example. I'm really glad I gave my birthday away. That well means a lot more to those people than anything I could have gotten for my birthday.
All right, I love that story of just radical generosity. I think that's so neat, especially at such a young age. Well, this week it finally happened. We knew it had to come. We knew it would be here eventually, but this week it finally snowed. How do you feel about that, guys? Come on. The collective silence, I imagine, is one of disapproval, okay? But it had to happen sometime. It just so happened. Not the earliest it's ever snowed in central Iowa, but it was the most for that day that it did snow. And my wife and I lived in an apartment for 5 years, so I'd kind of forgotten about the whole, shoveling your driveway thing. You know, it's one of the perks of renting is you don't have to do that. Until this last year where I had to shovel, probably, I don't know why, but I feel like our driveway is the longest driveway in the world. It was awful, okay? So go back. So basically, have you ever shoveled, though? Have you ever had this experience where you're shoveling, you only have a certain amount of time to be able to do it during your day? Have you ever shoveled during the snowstorm, while it's still snowing, right? Yeah, so you've had that experience. Maybe you've had this experience like I did this last year where you shovel your entire driveway, and then you get to the end of the driveway, and you look back, and the whole thing's white again, right? Yeah, that's the beauty of living in Iowa, I guess. It's terrible, right? But you got to take care of it. You got to get to it when you can, because if it accumulates, it causes all sorts of problems, doesn't it? If you let it just sit there and build up, it causes problems, okay? Because what will happen was it'll melt in the sun, and then it'll what? It'll refreeze, right? This is a picture of my patio, right? And I let it happen because I was so sick of shoveling my driveway. I'm like, I'm not shoveling my patio. Okay, that's crazy, right? You can see it turned into an ice rink really quick. That's 2 inches thick of ice right there. And by the way, doesn't that picture right there just make you so excited for winter? Doesn't that just encompass how winter feels right there? Just look at the beauty of that. Anyway, I also learned that your leaves don't go away under the snow unless you rake them up. So anyway, but it was a thick ice. And then what would happen was once the ice melted, all that accumulation melted, and it causes nasty puddles and water, right? You got to get rid of the snow. If you let it build up, it causes all sorts of problems, okay? The same, I believe, is true with our finances. The same can be absolutely true with our finances. If we choose to just simply hoard and let it accumulate without shoveling it back out and giving some of it away, I believe it can cause all sorts of problems for us internally as well. It can be dangerous to let it build up. Today, we're finishing out our sermon series called Pressure Valve. This is a financial freedom series. And we've talked all about how we believe that Christ and God wants us to live a life of freedom. And finances provide such a burden for so many people. And so what we realized is a couple months ago we had a message, I believe, on tithing. And then we quickly realized that there's a group of people in our church who, when the earthquake happens and relief is needed, or when the orphans need care in Haiti, or when the church has a campaign, there's a group of people who want to be able to give. They want to be able to be generous, but they have a hard time with it because maybe they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they don't have the financial literacy like they might want. So their heart is one where they want to be able to give and tithe and do all these incredible things when they arise, but they're just not sure how that's possible because they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they're struggling with their finances. And so that's where this series kind of came about, is how can we introduce just some practical, simple, bare minimum principles for our finances. And so we've talked about things like, what is your goal in life when it comes to your finances? What's your goal? We talked about budgeting and living within your means, how we need to take an appropriate look at our finances. Where's our money going? We talked about debt and how there's bad debt out there that we want to avoid. We also talked about savings and investing, the need to be able to think about the future. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of generosity, because we really believe that this is kind of the whole point of this entire series, is the whole bottom line for this entire message series is that we are called as believers in Jesus Christ to be generous people. And if you've been in the church long enough for any number of months or years, you know this, right? You know that we are called to be people who give. We're called to be people who are generous by nature. But maybe you've never actually had it explained to you as to why. And so today, we're going to walk through three quick reasons why that we are, as followers of Jesus, we are called to be generous people. Okay, so feel free, grab a pen, write on the back of your worship guides if you want, follow along with us, and we're going to jump right in today. Reason number one why I believe we are called to be generous people is because we give because our finances cannot be separated from our hearts. We give because our finances cannot be separated from our spiritual walk with God. In Matthew 6, Jesus says it this way. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." Verse 21, this is key. "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Maybe you've heard that before. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. They cannot be separated. A couple weeks ago, we said it's important to take a careful look at where your money is going and what you're spending it on, because what you spend your money on tells you a lot about what you care about. It just does. There's no way around it. And that's true in any organization. You've heard the saying before, money can't buy happiness, right? You've heard that before. And that's true to an extent, right? Studies have been done on this where they say, once you get past that level of income where you're not having to worry constantly about finances, what they found is once you reach past that level, that there's diminishing return on how much happiness your money can bring. It very quickly dips off, and the more money you have doesn't mean that you will be happier. So part of that is absolutely true. Money can't buy happiness. In fact, they did a study of multiple millionaires, and what they realized was that one of the best things that millionaires can do for their kids is give their money away and not give it to their children. Because it's through the earning and it's through the giving that they find satisfaction. So it's fascinating that there's this principle almost built into us by our design and by our nature by God, that once we reach that certain point where we have enough, where we have everything we need, that we are then called to turn around and give it away. It's almost built in to the very well-being of who we are. It's fascinating. Jesus, in another instance in Luke, chapter 12, this man shouts out to Jesus in the crowd, and he says, "Hey, Jesus, tell my brother to share his inheritance. I want my share of the inheritance." And Jesus is like, "What am I, your judge, and your arbiter? Why are you coming to me?" But then he gives this response in Luke 12. It says, he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Jesus speaks to the heart of the matter, not just the circumstances around it. He sees what the need actually is behind this statement. And then Jesus goes on to tell what's called the parable of the rich fool. I love that title, right? The parable of the rich fool. And basically the parable goes like this. There was a man who had an abundance. His crops were doing really well. He had a lot that he was bringing in, and his storehouses that he had built were overflowing. And so the man essentially says, well, you know what? I have so much coming in, I'm going to build a bigger storehouse. So that way I can host, or I can have more and more and more and accumulate. And what happens is he basically says, all right, I have a ton coming in. I've built a bigger storehouse now. I've torn down my old ones, and now I'm just going to relax. Easy street. Take life as it comes to me, right? Because I've stored up enough for myself. And what happens is, the reason he's called a fool is because on that very day, the man's life was taken from him. He dies. He can take nothing with him. And so the whole point of this parable is this. If there is an overflow coming into your life, if there's an abundance and an overflow of wealth, let it flow, right? Don't just hoard and accumulate and dam that up. Let it flow back out. Jesus concludes that parable in Luke 12, where he says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Maybe you guys have heard of some of the really bad fates that befall people when they play the lottery. Every year, almost when I was growing up in Christmas, we would have stocking stuffers. And so what would happen is one of my relatives, I don't know who exactly it was, probably an aunt or an uncle, they thought it was fun to give the kids lottery tickets in our little stocking stuffers, right? Or their little scratch-offs or whatever. That would be fun, right? Like, oh, man, you might win something, okay. What I didn't realize was that by doing so, my family member was actually increasing my odds of declaring bankruptcy, right? What do I mean by that? Well, what they found out is that if you are a lottery winner, you are, in 3 to 5 years, you are more likely than the average American to file for bankruptcy. Why is that? There's a lot of reasons that are part of it. Some of it is because they spend their money inappropriately or they spend it on stupid things. Sometimes, in some instances, they hoard it for themselves. And in other instances, they give too much away to all the wrong things, and they're not careful with it. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But it's fascinating that they've done these studies on these lottery winners, and what they found is like there's no evidence to believe that they're any happier in life just because they've had this influx of cash. It's because we're designed that when we overflow, we are allowed to continue to let it flow outward. Now, I know what you might be thinking, right? I know what you might be thinking where it's like, Ben, didn't just last week we talk about saving and investing for your future? Didn't we just talk about like being able to store up and save down the road? Isn't this kind of contradicting that? And I don't think it is, because I think the key here is found in that verse, Luke 12, that we just read. This is how it'll be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. See, there's nothing wrong with being able to store up and plan ahead and saying, this is exactly how much I'm probably going to need after I retire, factoring in medical costs, factoring in assisted living, whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with being able to plan ahead for the future as long as you're being rich towards God, right? That's the caveat there. That's the key to this message. We accumulate not just for ourselves, but to give outwardly. Why? Because our finances can never be separated from our hearts. Where our treasure is, there our hearts will be also. Reason number 2 why I believe believers are called to be generous people, why it's not just something that is a good idea, why we're actually commanded and called to do it, is that we give because much has been given to us. We give because much has been given to us. We said this before, but for God so loved the world that he what? He gave. He gave. And what did he give? He didn't just give something that wasn't important to him. He didn't just give something that was trivial. He gave his only begotten Son. God is a generous God, and we are called in his likeness and his image to be a people of generosity. 2 Corinthians verse 9, we read this. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. I love that. God has the ability to bless you abundantly in all times. Paul concludes the chapter, verse 14, and he writes this, "And in their prayers for you, their hearts will go out to you because of the surpassing grace God has," what? "Given you." Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. We give because God has given us surpassing grace in life. We give because God has given his only Son. Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift of his Son, Jesus Christ, for sending his Son to die on a cross for our sins, even though we didn't deserve it. Why? Because he loves us unconditionally. I love that bumper, that video of Kelly giving away her birthday party. What an incredible picture of someone who, even at a young age, has the maturity to say, you know what, I don't think that here as a young American, I don't think I need more stuff. But instead, I'm going to choose, instead of to receive, I'm going to choose to give it to perfect strangers in another country. What an incredible example of recognizing that I can give back out because I have been given so much. That's the heart of generosity, isn't it? Isn't that what the key is all about? And for Kelly to understand that is incredible. What we do as believers, as we're continuing to be generous, and whenever we give, we're actually making a statement. We're making a statement and a proclamation of three things. We're making a statement when we choose to give of one of gratitude in the past, saying, God has given me everything I need. Everything I have is his, and what we're saying is that I am grateful for it. This is why we're commanded, I believe, to give cheerfully, right? It's because God doesn't need your money, right? We understand that, right? To give out of compulsion or to give reluctantly, you don't do it. You don't get any credit for that in God's eyes. Does that make sense? But instead, we're meant to be giving cheerfully. Why? Because it's a statement of gratitude. Saying, God, thank you so much for everything I've received. Not only that, but it's a statement of priority in the present, right? Right here and now, I'm going to choose to align my priorities and say, you know what? God gets what's first in my life. I'm going to actively participate in this thing right here and now. God, you're first. Everything else comes second. And then finally, it's a statement of faith for the future. It's a statement of faith saying, God, I don't exactly know how it's going to work out right now, but I trust in the future that your promises are going to be true and that you will take care of me. You're making a proclamation to the world with these three things every time we give. We are to be called generous people because we have received so much. Do you have a life marked by gratitude? Just answer that in your own heart here today. Is your life marked and is everything filtered through that lens of saying that everything I have, man, God has just been so good to me? It's the starting point. It's the keystone to what we're talking about today. The third and final reason why believers are to give is this. We give because we believe that God will fill the gaps. That whenever we shovel out, that the snow is not limited and it'll continue to come down. That God will fill the gaps. There may be people, maybe even you sitting here today, maybe you have a hesitancy to this whole generosity thing, and I get it. Maybe for some of you, you're like, well, Ben, you don't know the ins and outs of my circumstances. You don't know the medical bills that I'm paying or the debt that I've gotten myself in. You don't know the child support that I have to pay every week, or you don't know what it's like to have this many kids and this. You don't know my circumstances. Giving isn't so easy. And I admit to you today, yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of each one of your circumstances. But I know that God does. I know that God does. Do you believe that God knows the ins and outs, every dollar in and out when it comes to your financial situation? I promise he does. There's a story in the Old Testament in the book of 2 Kings, and it's about the prophet Elijah. And this woman approaches this man of God, and it's a single mother. She has 2 kids. Her husband died, and she's in an incredible amount of debt. And the single mother approaches and she says, hey, if something doesn't change, my 2 kids are going to get sold into slavery. That's how much debt I'm in. And this man of God sees the situation. He tells her, he said, go and at first he asks her, he says, what do you have? What do you got that you can offer to God? She says, all I have is a jar of oil. Oil was valuable at this time. All I have is a jar of oil. And this man of God, Elijah, he says, go and find every single possible container and vase that you can find. Go to your neighbor's houses and grab every single vase that you can find. Go behind closed doors. Pour that jar of oil that you have into those vases, one by one, and see what happens. And sure enough, this woman goes behind closed doors, and container after container, this jar of oil that she has continues to fill up and fill up and fill up. All the containers that she could find, enough so that she had enough to pay off her debts. She could sell the oil, and she could be financially free. Guys, this is something that God has been doing for over 6,000 years, right? He knows the ins and outs of your finances. He will fill the gaps when we choose to be generous. There is no limited supply of oil. There is no limited supply when it comes to God. He will fill in the gaps. And what I love about this story is that it was the widow working alongside of God in order to make it happen, right? She was being obedient. She was going out and doing the work. She was finding the jars, and it made all the difference. There's a story that I love from this man. His name was R.G. Letourneau. And he lived about 70 years or so ago. He's an incredible, incredible man of God. And I want to just show you a real quick introduction to this man as we talk about him. Watch this video clip with me real quick.
When MacArthur needed an airfield on an island in the South Pacific, he called on the man who lays here. When Eisenhower needed a bridge to cross the Rhine into Germany, he called on the man who lays here. When the country needed an interstate highway system to move millions, when a young evangelist needed help to move men, he called on the man who lays here. His name was R.G. Letourneau. With a 6th grade education, he took a correspondence course, taught himself electrical and mechanical engineering, started a small business moving dirt. In his last years, he spent most of his time and money preaching, sharing his love for Christ, funding missionaries and missions around the world.
Where he built an endowment of over $40 million, of which 90% he gave away during his lifetime.
And thus the title R.G. Letourneau, Mover of Men and Mountains.
I am equipped, I'm designed by God, of all things, with dirt, with dirt. And so he took this great passion and giftedness and thought, you know what, I'm going to use this for the glory of God.
I love that story, and I don't know if you caught it. But this man, this famous businessman, using his gifts and his talents in his industry to worship and give generously to God. This man who brought in over $40 million in his lifetime. And it said that he gave away 90% of his income, and he lived off the 10. That is not something that we see in our culture today when it comes to wealthy people, but he understood something. He flipped it on its head. He said, I'm not just going to give 10%, pay myself 10%, and live on the 80. He said, I'm going to give away 90% because he believed in something, because he had a purpose. And I love this quote by R.G. It says this, I shovel out the money and God shovels it back, but God has a bigger shovel. This is a man who knew something about shoveling, right? God shovels it back in, and he has the bigger shovel. You see, R.G. understood Proverbs 3 when it says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. R.G. understood Deuteronomy 8 when it says, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to even produce wealth. Do you have that mindset? When you're working hard and you're earning your keep and you're providing for your family, is your mindset that reminder that it's God who even gives you the ability to get up in the morning and get busy and produce wealth? R.G. understood it. And this is not something that just has happened recently, but in the 1850s, there was a man named Charles Spurgeon, famous theologian. And for weeks, he was going around trying to raise money for his orphanage, trying to raise money, and he had raised 300 pounds in 1850. It's about the equivalent of 50 grand here today. And he raised 300 pounds, and as he accumulated this, he got this impression that he believed was from the Lord that he was called to go and give it away to a man named George Mueller. And so he wrestled with God and said, no, God, you don't understand. You see, I'm trying to be generous here and give this to my orphans. And yet God said, no, you're actually called to go give that money away. And so he said, yes, God, whatever you ask. And so eventually Charles went to George Mueller and he said, hey, here's 300 pounds. I believe that God's calling me to give it to you. And George Mueller replied, there's no way. This is the exact amount that I was praying for God to bring to me. So Charles gave it over to George Mueller in his orphanage. And when Charles returned back home, what was waiting for him at his house but 300 pounds plus interest? Guys, this is not just some story that happened one time in history. This is a story that crops up and reoccurs every single day with God. It's one of the greatest privileges, I believe, of growing up in the home of a pastor is you get to hear these stories time and time again of God providing the need, of checks showing up in the mail, of whatever it is at exactly the right moment. Charles Spurgeon, I love this quote from him too. God has a way of giving by the cartloads to those who give away by the shovelfuls. Isn't that true? You can't outgive God. It's not a promise that he's going to throw money back at you. That's not the guarantee here. But it is a promise that the reward that God gives back is always, always, always greater than what we can give to him. We give because God can fill the gaps. Do you believe that? Because he can fill the gaps. There's no shortage of snow. He is an abundant God. I want to kind of finish out this message today. We've talked about the why, of why we are called to be a generous people, if we're called followers of Christ. But I want to end this sermon today by giving some real quick practical principles about how to give, because I think that's important too, and we need to be careful. So real quick today, the first principle I would say for Christian generosity, the first principle I would say is give thoughtfully. Give thoughtfully, strategically. We all know that we all have maybe heard those stories of those little old grandmas, right, who give too much, you know what I mean? We're like, oh, I just want to give everything to my kids, and oh, I want to give to those TV preachers, and then they end up going broke, okay? A couple months ago or a year ago, I preached a sermon called When Helping Hurts, right? And we need to be careful, we need to be strategic, and we need to keep the big picture in mind because we don't want to be the type of generous person who's actually enabling someone else, okay? Enabling is when we take care of a need for someone else that they should be taking care of for themselves, right? Whereas giving and generosity is about taking care of a need of someone else that they can't take care of themselves. So first principle, I believe, is giving thoughtfully, giving strategically, knowing those charities or those organizations, doing your homework, keeping the big picture in mind. Principle number 2, I would say, is give sacrificially. Another great quote by Spurgeon, he writes, our gifts are not measured by the amount we contribute, but by the surplus kept in our own hand. Right? It's the story of the widow who gave the 2 coins, right? It's not just the amount that we contribute, but it's the amount we keep left over. We are called to give sacrificially. Give till it hurts. Give smart, but give till it hurts. Number 3 is give discreetly. The widow was called to go behind closed doors. Jesus tells us that when we are to pray, we are to go in the closet and pray quietly. Why? Because we need to be extra careful, not to do our deeds of righteousness for the eyes of men, right? Not just to go out and do and give and say, look what I did, here you go, check me out, right? Because giving is about the heart. So if our heart is not in the right place, if we're just doing it to be seen, we are missing the point. Fourth principle is give often. Give often. Don't just wait until December rolls around trying to sneak it in for that tax deduction, right? Give often. Build in those practices and those habits of giving. Fourth, or fifth, and finally, as the worship team comes up, is give cheerfully. Give cheerfully. Another way of saying this, and I think this is important to note, is this idea of giving selflessly, right? Not under the facade of giving for our own righteousness or for how people might view us, but be willing to give cheerfully out of the abundance of our hearts, out of the abundance of gratitude that we have. Are you a cheerful giver? Does it bring you joy to be able to bless one another, or are you just doing it for whatever reasons? Or are you doing it at all? We are called by God to be a people, to be a church that is known for its generosity. And I am so blessed to be in the position that I'm in as a pastor, because I have the unique privilege to be able to see firsthand just how incredibly generous our church is. I'm able in the position that I'm in to be able to see all the stories, to hear all the little pockets of things that people are doing for one another, taking care of one another in our church, and showing what Christian generosity is all about. I'm able to see and hear the stories about people who are donating Bibles to their mentees, donating Bibles to family members who are dying, people who donate and purchase Bibles for adult dancers for the ministry of Jericho. To see and hear stories about electrical bills being paid for other members, for people bringing meals when they're sick, for people who are willing to donate office space for Jericho ministry. It's the story of our church people raising $32,000 just to start this Ankeny campus here, above and beyond what they normally do. It's the stories of just in the last few years of 5 cars being donated to people who had a need. It's the story of the pre-K worker and the midweek prep person for kids, donating their time and donating supplies to our kids, not asking once for reimbursement. Stories about repairing a single mom's car free of charge, no parts, no labor, no cost. Of AC repairs being done, maintenance being done. Of a family in Colfax being willing to give $1,000 to a single mom who had to have brain surgery, and then watching her kids because she had to miss work. It's the stories of people approaching me saying, hey, I don't want there to be a single kid who can't go to the retreat because of money. I'll sponsor them. Every single time we have camp. Every single time we have a retreat. It's the story of a pre-K worker having teenagers over to her house to do some work and then donating thousands of dollars so that they can go to camp. It's the story of every single one of our volunteers who are willing to give their time, give their talents, give their treasures, because they believe in the mission of Jesus Christ. And they believe that they want to give freely because they have been freely given so much by Jesus. Time and time again, radical generosity. And it's changing people's lives. And it matters. That's a fraction of the list that I had. It's a fraction, and that's just the stories I know about. Generosity is built into who we are. We're made for this. We're made to store up our treasures in the place that matters most for the kingdom of God, for eternity, for heaven. That's what matters. We cannot bring a cent with us when we die. Do you have that outlook? Do you have that perspective? Is God calling you to step out in generosity in some way or another? The reality is that our finances are connected to our hearts and connected to our spiritual walk with Jesus. So let's give our hearts to him. Let's give our hearts to the one who will never let us down. Let's give our hearts to the only one who can keep it safe. Let's give our hearts to Jesus, because he will never let us down. We'll never be disappointed. We can never shovel out too much, where he just will shovel back in. We can never outgive him, never outbless him. He is abundant. He is sovereign. He is Lord over all. He knows your situation. He cares about it. He's going to do something about it. Give your heart to Jesus. He'll take care of it. Let's pray.